What's up everyone? It is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. And so today is a very exciting video because I am going to be joined by my friend Kevin, who is going to med school in the fall. And you may recognize Kevin because we did another video on my channel where Kevin talked about how he got into college and how his experiences in college has prepared him to apply to med school. So definitely check that video out. I will have it linked down below. And so if you are a student applying to colleges this cycle, you should definitely check out Study Hall College Consulting. We are a team of current college students and recent graduates where we specialize in reviewing college application essays and consulting one-on-one with students and parents. So definitely check out all of our social medias. On our website, we have a blog where we post weekly advice. And then on our social media pages, we also post a lot of tips and tricks from our advice and experiences. So without further ado, let's go talk with Kevin. Awesome. So it looks like we are recording via Zoom now. I am joined by my friend Kevin. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hey guys. Thanks for having me back, Rachel. As a quick introduction, I'm an incoming MD-PhD student at Harvard and MIT. Previously, I studied computer science and biology while I was at Duke. And then I did a one-year master's program at Tsinghua University in Beijing, China as a Schwarzman Scholar. I'll probably focus more for this conversation on the med school application process, although the MD-PhD application process is a little bit different. But I can focus on the MD portion for the sake of this conversation. So yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So my first question for you, Kevin, would be what is the med school application process like? Is there a general timeline you can share?
So the med school application process, timeline-wise, is actually a little different than what, like, for example, the AMC will share on the website. For example, like for college apps, usually things don't have a rolling deadline. You turn it in like close to like when the actual deadline is, and it's totally fine. In the med school timeline, things are very rolling. So as soon as any application or like steps open up, it's important to get in really early because the later you wait, the harder it'll be to move on to like the next step. The med school application timeline wise looks like primary will open up sometime in like late May, early June. And then soon after, these primary applications will get transmitted to schools, and then schools that like you will send you a secondary that you then complete. And then when you send the secondary back in, usually you try to get it in within like 2 weeks, but I'm happy to talk more about that later. Then potential interviews come out. And so all this happens up until maybe around February. And then throughout March is when most schools will announce admissions decisions. The AMC covers almost all med schools. The only ones it doesn't cover are Texas-based med schools. So any listeners to this video that are based in Texas, you have a very different process. But for AMC people, the way it works is when you send in your primary, you also put in a select list of schools that you're interested in. And every single school costs extra money. And so it's important to be, smart about what schools you put in. Honestly, the way you build a school list is actually quite hard. And this serves a video in and of itself. But you want to pick schools, like just put very briefly, you want to pick schools that are good fits for you, like score-wise, are good fits for you in terms of like overall mission. And a lot of people don't know this. People just assume med schools all have the same mission to build like doctors, but a lot of schools actually have very different missions. If you read some of their like details about, what they look for and like what the purpose of their med school is, you get a good taste of, why this med school exists and what types of students they're trying to attract. So making sure that your personal mission aligns with the mission of your medical school. Location, a big thing too. I would like put like 3 asterisks by this, or like 3 stars, and bold it and italicize it for everyone listening in, if I could. And this is like on paper, is to make sure you look at whether or not these schools even accept out-of-state students. A lot of medical schools don't take out-of-state students, or their acceptance rate is like 1/10 of what it is for in-states. If a medical school reserves 98% of its slots for in-state students, it only gives 2% of slots for out-of-state students, you probably don't want to waste the money to apply there. So it takes a lot of effort to build a good school list because you need to make sure that all of these things align.
Okay, yeah, like a year-long process, sort of similar to the law school application process, where it's also rolling deadlines and not just, oh, a finite date, get your applications in at this point. So, in terms of applications, can you talk a little bit about how you studied for the MCAT and when you took the MCAT?
So I took the MCAT pretty late for a med student applying in this cycle. Part of that was because of COVID, but I actually submitted my primary without my MCAT yet. So one of the fun facts I can share is that you can actually take the MCAT like later, like while simultaneously applying for med school, and then AMC will automatically put your MCAT back in and edit your application before you sign up for example, for secondaries. But as far as like tips for the MCAT, there's so much. You could do an entire video on just MCAT. But I'm a big fan of using like different study like books. I'm a big fan of the Kaplan series as well as Exam Crackers. I think both of those MCAT book sets are very comprehensive and very good. But the big thing for me is I found a lot of benefit by studying alongside the subreddit RMCAT. There's a ton of great resources there with different timelines, different people's stories on how they applied, how they studied for the MCAT. A lot of the key, I think, like tools that really helped me were the two books in order to build like a foundation for you to like study upon using this software called Anki, Anki, that helps you memorize different like vocab words and concepts and for the MCAT, that's really important because there's just a ton of concepts to memorize. There's also this software platform called UWorld that a lot of people recommend, and I use it a lot too. That gives you a lot of practice questions, and that helps you build things like, for example, endurance, as well as get you familiar with what types of problems you can get on the MCAT. And then the biggest number one tip I can give is that it's important to start taking what we call full lengths early on. I believe there's now 4 or 5 full lengths. So these are like official MCATs that in the past that are now released publicly with explanations on like, different answers. Because there's only like 4 or 5, it's really important that you save them for like critical periods of time. So I used one pretty early on in order to get like the feel for what type of questions the MCAT is like. And then I saved a lot of them for like my last 2 weeks, 3 weeks of studying. That way, I could, that's when you try to like boost your score as much as possible, but like trying to refine like each of the types of questions you get asked.
So, another part of the application process would be letters of recommendation. So, how did you get your letters of recommendation? And do you have any tips for students asking professors, other professionals for letters of rec?
I think the minimum amount of letters recommendation you want for an MD student is I think around 3. I think for MD-PhD, it's probably like around 5 or 6. I think I submitted around 6. And so the big things you want to keep in consideration for letters recommendation are you want to have at least one science and one non-science based letter. And so I asked 2 professors that taught one science course and one non-science course that knew me like fairly well and that did well in their classes. And this is something I think people should focus actually like pretty early on. I'll be the first to admit that like most professors that I took classes with did not know my name because I just sat in the back of the classroom in a lecture hall and participated 0 and did like decently on tests, but like never really, actively went to things. A lot of the classes I took at Duke were seminar based, so they're relatively small. I ended up just picking seminar classes where the professor like knew who I was, at least like recognized my face, and then developed over time. I was also very fortunate that I actually took one of my biology classes, the one I got my science letter from, with my major advisor, who I'd already known for a number of years. He was able to speak towards not just my academic performance, but also like my growth as an individual throughout college. And so I thought that was a cool dimension to be able to add in to like this like set of letters. I think for any like pre-med students like listening right now, it's pretty important that you take an active role early on to identify who you want to write these letters. And for the people that you do want to write those letters, you take an active role in making sure that that's professor or that faculty member sees you as like someone that's more than the test score. So going to office hours, participating in class, emailing and checking in with them, letting them know that you're like an actual human being and someone that's worth like mentoring. So I think that's really valuable. That addresses I think like the professors or academic letters. In addition to that, you usually want one letter from every single professor you've done research with. Most schools will ask you to have a letter for every single PI. And if you don't have the PI's name down or a letter down, then you can't really list them as a research like extracurricular or something. Since I've done research with a few different PIs, I end up having 3 letters from them. That's the reason, for example, the MD-PhD usually has a few extra letters more than normal. And yeah, otherwise, anyone that has employed you in the past or can speak to different characteristics for yourself, I think those are all good people to ask for letters. One of my tips I have for selecting letter writers too are that I want to say like the majority of letters of recommendation that are probably written are very generic. Most professors have a template and they kind of just plug in a student name, plug in a grade, plug in a percentile. This student was in the top 3% of all students I ever taught, and then like have a few generic sentences. If there's something that you want the professor to write about, you should tell them that. I found it very helpful that before I applied for med school a few months beforehand, I reached out to different professors I wanted to write letters of recommendation, and I literally told them like specific stories about me, like with them, like obviously true. They were also a part of it, so they know. But sometimes helping to say stuff like that can jog a professor's memory since they have to write so many different stories and letters. And so anything you can do to help make that letter be more personalized to you, I think is really effective.
Another part of the application process for med schools would be the essays. So, can you talk a little bit about how you crafted your personal statement essays? Any tips for other students about how to brainstorm and like maybe what are some things that you wrote about?
The personal statement essays are pretty difficult to address, I think, like succinctly, and they're also very personal for every individual, hence the word personal statement. Put like briefly, the personal statement essays for med students are essentially like one big essay, basically saying like, why do you want to be a doctor? And then if you apply MD-PhD, you get 2 more essays. One where it's why do you want to be a physician scientist, slash like why MD-PhD, and then another that's tell me about your research experiences. But like I'll address this from like an MD perspective. I think it's really important that the personal statement is, unique and is able to capture a lot of reasons that like are very personal to you about like, why you want to be a doctor. For me, I found the easiest way for me to be able to craft this like narrative was to draw upon my own personal experiences previously as an EMT. While I was at Duke, I worked as an EMT on the side. And so as an EMT, I got to like treat lots of patients and like hear their stories. And so from those experiences, it kind of refined my own personal desire to be a doctor. And so I just, explained that and talked about it in my essays. I know a lot of other people choose to make their personal statements a mix of like different experiences, whether it's, some like shadowing experiences they've had, as well as, research and blending it all together. And I think that's totally legitimate too. But for me, it was easier to just explain it from a very like one-dimensional, like flush out this one story like in its entirety kind of view.
Thank you for sharing that. And so, like the letters of recommendation, personal statement essays, all of those would be part of the primary application. So, would you be able to explain some more about the secondary application?
Again, to recap on the timeline, once primary applications are released, you have a number of like months essentially to get the primary in, but it's not really a number of months. You should really try to get in as early as possible. The way that the AMC works is that once you submit the primary, they start going through and verifying your like transcript and like your primary information one by one. And so the later you turn it in, the longer your review time is. In some cases, I believe at peak, the review time can be like 6 or 7 weeks. And so that's a major disadvantage if you apply like a little bit later and you're in the middle of peak transmission time, which delays your application another by 6 or 7 weeks. Even worse if your application gets rejected by the AMC being like, hey, there's something wrong with your transcript and you have to resubmit your primary. Then you're delayed a number of months again. And the longer it's delayed, the worse your overall odds are of getting like an acceptance early on, as well as getting acceptance at all or interview invites. As far as like what the secondary is like, after your personal statement has been transmitted, different schools can start pulling applications. I'll be the first to say that it's pretty common to get secondaries for almost every single school you apply to, not because they actually like you, but because it gives them more money. The secondary application costs about $100 extra to submit. And so most schools will accept nearly all primaries and give you a secondary, or they might just do an arbitrary GPA cutoff. Everything below like a 3.5 or something gets cut. Everything above a 3.5 or a certain MCAT score. As far as the secondary itself, this differs like significantly school to school. Some secondary applications are very, very long, like 7, 8, 9 essays. Some are short, just like one essay. But there's a lot of overlap, I would say, in the types of questions that secondary applications ask. What I did was after I submitted my primary, I waited for all of the emails to come in from the secondary, made a huge spreadsheet of every single question that I had to write, and then just started going for it. And then I realized that like a lot of the questions are like very similar or repeats, in which case you can just kind of, or like with different word counts, right? So like maybe like 300 words in this one for like your, I don't know, proudest accomplishment. And this other one is 500 words for the same question. And so you cut in and expand for every single different school. But yeah, I would say that one of my like pro tips for the secondary, I didn't do this, but I probably should have, is that most schools will use the same secondary questions that they did in previous years. And so if you're witty about this, you can go onto like websites like Student Doctor Network and then see what the old secondaries look like. And you can start pre-writing those applications if you really want. Otherwise, it gets very, very challenging. The general advice people give is to turn in secondary applications within 2 weeks of receiving it. It sounds not too bad, but the problem is that when you apply to, let's say, like 20, 30, 40 schools, and they all give you this primary at the same time, so all their secondaries are due around the same time too, then you're stuck with just a crap load of writing in a very short period of time. For me, because I didn't pre-write, I actually ended up submitting a lot of my secondaries like pretty late, like 4 or 5 weeks after receiving. It didn't end up making a huge difference, but the general advice people give is like turn it within 2 weeks. And if you can, I would say try to do that. I think as a result of me turning in my secondaries a little bit later, I actually didn't receive interviews until like a month or two after most of my friends. So if you want to save yourself that, a little bit of stress, I would suggest trying to turn in your secondaries earlier rather than later.
That sounds like such a long and very complicated process. Definitely, listeners, you will probably have to do some of your own research. And what Kevin is saying is definitely a good starting point. So, like you just mentioned, after the secondary application, then med schools could potentially offer you an invite to interview. So, can you explain your experiences with that and any tips on interviewing for med schools?
So for med school interviews, they usually start coming out, I believe, around maybe like September-ish, all the way through February. And they could come at any time. Usually when they come out, they give you a few different options that you could like pick dates on. And usually it's in person. So in most cases, it's in person and you fly out. If you choose to stay the night, that's on you too. Unlike like actual like interviews for jobs, where everything's paid for, you pay out of pocket for all interviews and hotel stuff. That's actually probably like the biggest contributor to med school application costs. It's a very expensive process. Once you actually get to interview and you fly out and you get to the institution, speaking from a Zoom perspective, there's a few different types of med school interviews you can get. And so the two big categories that there are called MMIs, multiple mini interviews, as well as like the normal, like traditional interviews. And I can address both of those, even though technically I've never actually done MMI, but I think I have the general gist of it. So traditional interviews are ones that are usually between something like 25 to 45 minutes long. It's with a single faculty member usually or a student, and it can either be blind or open book. So in a blind interview, they don't know anything about you other than what you tell them. And so for an open book interview, they can see your scores, they can see your essays. And so sometimes a lot of those interviewers, they've already read through your application, can start going with heavy hitting questions from the get-go. For a blind interview, then it's governed entirely by what you tell them, and then they can follow up. And so for these types of interviews, I think there's like two big things that are really, really important. One is making sure that whatever you say is in line with your application. And so that means, for example, if you talk about a story like in your essay, you better make sure it's the same story or it's in line with what you say in the interview. But it also means, if you say that you've done like 2,000 hours of research in this one specific field and you like did a lot of like this one specific experiment, if they ask you questions about that experiment, you should definitely be able to answer it. I've actually had interviewers, and granted, this is MD-PhD, and so there's slightly more pressure on the research side, but I've had interviewers read through my papers and ask me specific questions about, hey, like, I saw that you used this technique for this specific experiment. Why didn't you do this? Or, how do you, consider like this recent finding from like this different research group that doesn't exactly fall in line with yours. Like there's like some conflict here. What are your theories or like what are your potential explanations for why that might be? I think that's probably on the very extreme end, mostly because I had an MD-PhD interview on that one. But it's totally possible for med school interviews to be able to ask stuff like that. I think 99% of the time, though, you're going to get questions like, hey, why do you want to be a doctor? Tell me about some experiences that, that led you to want to be a doctor, greatest weaknesses, past accomplishments. Some of those are very, very basic questions. But yeah, I think that's one of the major difficulties in med school interviews because it could be really anywhere. And it really depends on the type of interview and the type of interviewer you get. The other types of interviews that are getting more and more popular right now. And so I know like schools like Duke, Stanford do it, is the multiple mini interview, MMI. Instead of 1 or 2 long interviews, instead you get like 7, 8, 9 tiny interviews that are like 10 minutes long. And oftentimes they're scenario based. So what'll happen is you go into a room, they can either be about you or a scenario. For example, like it might be like an ethical dilemma. If you are a physician and you only have like one like organ to transplant, and if you like everyone else will die. And here's like 4 different types of patients. Like you have a 7-year-old, you have like a 89-year-old, you have like a 16-year-old, but like has been a robber in the past. You have a 58-year-old, but so like a bunch of ethical dilemma stuff. And you have to give like a 7 or 8 minute answer to who you would choose to give the transplant to and why. I'm very thankful that I never had to do an MMI despite like prepping for it a little bit. But what's good to know, and I want like all listeners to like hear this, is there's really no wrong answer. You just need to be able to defend it in such a way that it's reasonable. There are wrong answers in the sense that if you explain your answer and it's like very ethically poor, that's clearly wrong. Like, for example, between the 7 and the 98, ethically wrong answer would be, well, I wouldn't give it to the old person because they've already lived a long life and so they don't deserve to live anymore. That would be a bad answer to give. But it's totally justifiable to explain which of like the 4 people might want to get the transplant. But you just have to be able to reason in a way that's ethically reasonable. So you have like the ethics-based ones or scenario-based ones. Another common scenario-based question might be like, hey, like role play, pretend to be a physician. I'm the parent of a patient who just passed away, and being able to like role play some of those scenarios. Those are much less common, but I have heard stories of them existing. Other types of MMI questions include just normal like questions that are kind of borrowed from the traditional world, just being like, hey, like tell me about a scenario where you met someone or worked with someone that had a very different background as you, which is like a common question you get from like behavioral interviews. Stuff like that is all pretty common.
No, yeah, definitely. I feel like that topic of like interviewing, interview tips, interview types could also be a whole other video as
Yeah,
well. This
yeah.
whole process is like very long, a lot of steps, it seems like. You briefly mentioned this, but you said a lot of students apply to 20, 30, 40 med schools, which can be very expensive, like you're saying, with different application fees, flying out for interviews. So, can you talk a little bit about the number of med school programs that you applied to, and how did you make your final decision on the Harvard MIT PhD MD program?
There's a lot of different ways people end up picking schools. For me, I had a few criteria that are really important to me. So I only applied to schools on the East and West Coast. I didn't want to be in the Midwest, just for personal reasons. I only applied to schools that were mostly based in cities, also again for personal reasons. And I also tried to apply to schools that had a heavier research program because those are ones that I felt most aligned with my own personal interests and also were ones that had MD-PhD programs. For me, I applied to probably more schools than a lot more schools actually than the average applicant. I would assume the average applicant probably applies to somewhere around like 12 or 13 programs is my guess. Duke Health Advising told me that the average amount of schools that a Duke applicant applies to is around 20. I applied to, I think, like 41, 42 programs. I'm not super sure what the number is, but it was a lot of money. And I built that list primarily because it's very, very hard, I think, MD PhD wise, to predict where you end up because there's so few slots. A lot of these programs, they only accept, or they only have like 2 or 3 people in the program per year. And so being able to vie out for, compete for one of those slots is very, very tough. And so for me, I cast a very wide open net. compared to like your average, I think like top medical student application, I had a relatively unbalanced app where like my like GPA and test scores weren't quite at the very top, but like some of my extracurriculars I felt like were much more competitive. And so it's hard for me to predict early on. Like this time last year during the application cycle, like I had no idea like what type of school I'd end up at. So I applied much more broadly than I'd say most people do. As far as like choosing a med school at the very end, the main advice I can give is to try and really think about, what things will make you happy. 99% of med schools have the exact same medical school curriculum. They all fall under national standards. They're all about the same. I think factors that are worth considering are, what schools will you go to where you can really be a human being and be happy? Making sure that the city or area that it's based in is somewhere you really like and you can see yourself developing because you're spending, half a decade there. Might as well make sure it's somewhere that you can see yourself being happy because at the end of the day, when you come back from a hard test or a hard day in clinic, it's not going to be you being like, wow, I'm so glad I went to this school that like brightens your day. It's the fact that, hey, having a significant other or friends or parents around de-stress with other people and a good support network is really important. So I think that's like the number one thing. Other things I would take in consideration are the type of students that are there. A lot of different schools attract different types of students. We missed a step here in that like after med school acceptances come out, there's also a revisit weekend usually. And during that revisit time, I think one of the most important things you can do is meet and get to know other students. Because a lot of these students, they're going to be people that you're stuck with for a very, very long time. And some of the personalities in different schools can be pretty different. And so making sure that whatever student body you'll be stuck with is one that you find yourself being able to find long-term friends. And I think it's really important. Other things I think are pretty important too are besides like location, besides like students, are like the priorities of the medical school. For me, I'm someone that's super interested in like this intersection between like, computation and medicine. For me, being able to access a lot of resources, for example, like MIT, was really important to me because it would, I think, give me like significance edge in my research. And so I was really excited by the Harvard MIT program.
Congratulations again, definitely some amazing programs and schools that you were accepted into. So my final question would be, do you have any final tips for students who may be interested in medical school in the future?
My biggest tip for anyone that's interested in medical school or pre-med is to maybe think very carefully about why you're interested in the first place. I think a lot of people get started on this track and don't realize until much later on, maybe to the point where they can't even turn back, that this isn't actually something they want. The process to become a physician in America is very, very long and tough and very expensive and requires a lot of personal sacrifice. Making sure this is something that you really want isn't something that, for example, your parents or other people or society or your mentors have pressured onto you is the biggest thing I can suggest. Any like high schoolers listening in, I know, for example, that these BSMD programs, for example, are very, very common. And I actually applied to them and was accepted to a few as well. And so a BSMD program, for anyone not listening, for not familiar, is like basically an auto admit for as a high schooler to medical school. And so you basically go to undergrad and you have a guaranteed spot in the medical school as long as you pass. It sounds really nice on paper, but I actually would never recommend a BSMD program because I think it's so hard to know at 16, 17, 18 years old whether or not you actually want to be a doctor. I actually think it's even very tough at 21, 22 to know whether or not you really want to be a doctor. People that are interested in, the process of helping people, I would say there's a lot of other careers that do the same thing, perhaps in a much shorter time frame with less sacrifice. For people that are interested in the money, there's other careers that are much more financially rewarding, like much more financially rewarding, that also have require less sacrifice. So the big thing for me is try to understand why you really want to be a doctor. Try to understand, what the process is really like. Do you understand the full process between medical school, how much it costs, residency, how many hours you're working, how long it is, fellowship, and then as an attending or a private practice physician, what your day-to-day like is really like if that's something that you really want for yourself. Because in my opinion, I think a lot of students get kind of hyped up into the idea of medicine and they try and they have a romanticized version of what this is. And so, yeah, for those of you who are truly interested in medicine, My guess is you probably don't even need any of the advice that I gave in this interview at all, because for those of you that are truly passionate, like it's natural to do everything you can to like try and explore these things. But for a lot of people, including myself, I think up until a few years ago, it was very tough for me to like actually understand like why I really want to be a doctor. So yeah, I think asking those questions for yourself, talking with medical students, talking with residents, seeing if one, they're happy, and two, if you would be happy in their shoes, are all important factors to consider.
100%. I agree. I think that is something definitely that students should be thinking about and looking at. You don't want to do anything, especially things that cost a lot of money, take tons of years of your life if you're not truly 100% invested or passionate in it. So I can definitely agree with that. So that is all of my questions for you, Kevin. Thank you so much for hopping on this call and doing another video with me. For anyone watching this video, you should definitely check out the other video I did with Kevin where he talks about his high school and college experiences to get him prepared to apply for medical schools. So definitely check that out as well if you want more advice from him. If you have any questions for Kevin, definitely leave a comment down below and myself or Kevin can answer it for you. And with that, I wanted to thank you all so much for watching. It really means a lot. Make sure you like this video to help me out with the YouTube algorithm and subscribe to my channel to see more. And I will see you all next time.